another edition of Expanding Mind. I'm your host, Erik Davis, continuing our ongoing conversations about the cultures of consciousness. I did a fun event recently at the Roxy here in San Francisco called The Holy Hate, where I showed some rare and priceless clips from local Oddball Cinema's amazing archive and talked about the varieties of hippie religious experience. And it was quite a lot of fun. And most of the clips and stories were centered in the Bay Area or California. And afterwards went out to grab a beer with some friends, including John Law, the famous Cacophony Society rabble-rouser and early Burning Man culture crafter who left the event early in the mid 90s before it began to metastasize into what it is today. We've had John on the show, but what he was talking about is that lately he's had the opportunity to go give talks to people around the world about what made San Francisco the unique incubator of weird culture that it was, and is not so much today, but still has the ambiance of it. And John was talking about the various elements, in particular in the 1970s, that created this kind of post-punk, industrial, wacky, satirical, sort of hippie, sort of anti-hippie, psychedelic weirdness that helped spawn the Survival Research Labs and ultimately Burning Man, as well as many other events. And he was talking about a couple of things. One is that it was that San Francisco had cheap rents. It already had a history of weirdos and freaks and sexual outlaws coming and making the city of their own. So it was kind of a beacon for weirdos everywhere. But one of the other factors was that there wasn't really, especially at that time, long before the rise of the internet economy, there really wasn't the same kind of professionalism or professional opportunities you would have here as you would in Los Angeles or New York or maybe even Chicago. And that created a sort of separate world where creativity could take a different form. And the other thing he said that's worth thinking about was that unlike other sorts of avant-garde scenes, I mean, in many ways, the San Francisco avant-garde in particular is more resembles a lot of European stuff than I think other cities in America, even New York, Los Angeles, other places. There was a certain kind of Dadaistic, wacky, out of the box, experimental, creative, social reinvention. But at the same time, it didn't really have the kind of highbrow intellectual discourse that a lot of European avant-gardes were always mixed up. So people were kind of allowed to do whatever they wanted to. So there's this kind of glorious, almost lowbrow naivete that was allowed to mix with these avant-garde aspirations and ideas of new societies and, of course, the satire and critique of mainstream America. And so all these things really got me thinking about San Francisco, about what made its creative world so innovative, particularly after the hippie era. So we're talking the 70s and 80s, the sort of punk era and the things that emerged from that. And I could think of no better person to try to hash some of this out with than Mark Petrakis, who I know more regularly as the Spoonman, who's one of his alternate IDs. And he's been a figure in the Bay Area scene for quite a while, as a performer, event organizer, early website developer for all the weirdos and freaks. He's worked with the Residents, with the Institute for the Future, doing events and coordinations, and probably known best for the series of events that he organized at the Anon Salon in Soma for almost 20 years. And again, these were events that showcase the particular peculiarities of San Francisco avant-garde theater, interaction, silliness, humor, satire. And so I just wanted to bring Spoonman onto the show. He's one of these guys. I show up, I see him at parties. We have amazing conversations, but I've never really delved into his story. And so, Mark, welcome to Expanding Mind.
All righty. Thanks for having me. Sounds fun. You set
All
up
right.
a whole bunch of stories there, didn't you?
You know it. Well, let's start with the name. Who is the Spoon Man? Where did
Well,
he come from?
Man came from, I don't know, man. I'm just thinking how to pull it out of time. I was doing theater, and we had a really vibrant scene in the late '80s with a lot of really funny guys who were doing theater. There was a group called Dude Theater. There was an Elbows Akimbo dance company. It was a really fun, talented people, kind of just coming into their prime. Central Wilson was part of that. Michael McShane, great comic. Greg Proops, great comic. And anyway, nobody had any money, so we started doing benefits for each other. And we did these late night benefits, and everybody sort of contributed something. And you could work with the other people. And so I just sat down one day, and all of a sudden this voice came into my head that said, "Who you are, what you want. You come steal food of man who already have spoon, man who already ready to eat. You come steal Spoonman's food. No one time, no two time, no three time, maybe four. You come again, you pay attention. I smack you hard, you taste pain. Be good now, sit and listen, listen." So he just does his pompous, goofy clown thing. But then I got Michael to do part of Crazy Grandmother, and got somebody else to do a part, and we did it, and it was a 5 minute piece, and everybody did 5 minutes, and it was insanely good. I mean, the place was tore up. I mean, it just falling apart. So after that, I just said, well, this is the life for me. Vaudeville at this level is just where I'm at. So I kept writing Spoonman pieces. Spoonman became an MC. I wrote Spoonman Puppet Show, little, crazy little characters that spun out from that first thing. So there was Pointy Face and Pointy Face Man. He was the villain, and there was Flathead, and he was the White Knight, and then there was Crazy Grandmother who would sit on them at the end. So it was very kind of chaotic and surreal and fun. But those were my people. And so when I started doing Cobra Lounge as an official show, midnight show, I just bring in all the people in the community that were great. And I wouldn't give them any directions except, I know you're great, do 5 minutes, no more than 5 minutes. And then we put up like eight improvising musicians and whatever slide projectors we can pull together, and drape the place in visqueen and just do the show, no rehearsal. And it always worked great.
So let's. I mean, I want to stay there because I don't think that's going on in other places. I mean, there's something specific both about the role of improvisation, of just spontaneity and just jumping on the goof, and two, a certain kind of humor, a certain flavor that's a bit Dada, a bit sarcastic, but still life affirming. I don't know. I'm just kind of fishing here because I don't really know this period. I don't really know these times. But from talking to you and from seeing the kind of events associated with the scene later on, it feels like there's something kind of specific going on about the humor and about the spontaneity.
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, the whole Dada side of things brings in chaos. It brings in disruption. The idea of not politically correct or pushing some kind of envelope. That was a kind of a pre-label time. And I think increasingly we're getting boxed in by labels of all sorts. And so, the kind of goofy, exploratory humor, it just gets harder to support. I mean, how do you support it in an environment when, the cost of renting a venue is so high, and the insurance and the permits? I mean, a lot of what we were doing in the with the non-salon and all was kind of skirting around the edges of permitting and insurance and which of course can lead to horrible things like ghost ship, but you can't take it away without basically gutting a whole lot of creative energy. And so I think at that particular time, everybody was just all, balls to the wall and felt that they could do anything. Dude Theater did some wonderful, wonderful shows. They're just so funny and so, anarchistic. So,
yeah. We'll talk about, I mean, that's another thing is like the politics of it are kind of interesting, where it seems like, punk in the most general sense kind of cleared the room of like a certain sort of earnestness. So even if you were very critical of mainstream society and very, very clear that there were better, more interesting ways of doing things, that didn't lead to a sense of like calling for a new sort of social movement or a new sort of organizing ideology. Instead, there was this kind of turn towards pranks, towards surrealist humor, towards the unknown, towards a kind of wackiness, but it still had a kind of a sort of politics to it, a sort of anarchist politics to it. Were you sort of aware of that, or like how did you feel like the politics of what you were doing, since it was so dependent on actual economic conditions, on the new forms of relationship that people were having with each other, deciding what does it mean to have an event, what does it mean to perform? Like there was a whole kind of very collective situation that was going on. So how would you characterize that, the sort of political sensibility there?
Well, number one, there was, going back right to the 60s and the 70s, which is, of interest to you and which is actually part of my history. Like there was that explosion that happened, right? And also you come out, and I think, age or youth or possibility is just important, biologically speaking. You're going to, I got to stay up all night and work on this shit. That's not a problem. Well, you get older and you don't do that anymore. So the kind of anarchy that you need is a kind of confluence of forces that work to enable that kind of perspective. You certainly don't think about Gerald Ford in the White House, or even Richard Nixon, and then God help you, Ronald Reagan comes along, and it was still okay, and maybe there was some kind of the cancer wasn't as advanced at that time. Even though Reagan was a cancerous character, it didn't filter down. Are you okay now?
Yeah.
It didn't filter down to the local level. People were living relatively inexpensively. There was a lot of interaction. Are we losing our signal here? You're blipping.
I'm okay.
Okay, I'm hearing this blip 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 sound, but it's okay. It's not strong. So I'm saying then that you've got those confluence of forces that kind of just lead you to follow the instinct, right? I mean, where's that great line from the great idea that Gombrich in the History of Art said, it wasn't an accident that there were 200 impressionists painting in Paris at the same time, right? I mean, they were looking over each other's shoulders and going, well, if you can do that, I can do that. And what's to stop me? What's to stop me? And certainly, I don't think politics was a big block at that time. We were living in San Francisco too, of George Moscone and Harvey Milk. It was perfectly fine to strut your gayness. The Sisters of Perpetual Indulgence, the Coquettes, Angels of Light. Sheesh. I mean, so there was this encouragement to just express yourself, and there wasn't the boxes that the larger culture felt constrained to put you into. And I think what over time, the economic lines, the political lines, and also let's not, forget technology as a herding technology, in terms of, dividing you into your friends in these boxes and who's your followers. And, it's just like, wow, that's very not chaotic. That's very not anarchistic. So I think there was this explosion, and that sort of allowed you to work around whatever kinds of constraints we see as big today that were not quite so big then.
Yeah, I want to get to some of the contemporary stuff, but I still want to maybe out of pure nostalgia stay a little bit with back in the day. When did you move to San Francisco? I mean, you were already doing performance and stuff before you came here, if I know the story right.
Yeah, well, I came in the mid '70s, and you know, I was I came here kind of in a kind of a spiritual context. I was living in Chicago and hanging out with all my bluesy friends and doing theater, and I got into the meditation thing, and I thought, oh man, it just sort of tripped me out. It suddenly like all of a sudden I was like, I lost, I don't know, just stopped, I just changed, like got a lot more chill. Because I'd lived in New York and I'd lived in Chicago and I was pretty high strung. And, and after, a couple hours of meditation a day for 6 months, I felt different. So I wanted to be around that energy. And, I come out of a Greek background too, right? I'm old, my parents are both born here, but all my grandparents are born in Greece. So I grew up around all these Greeks, all this, community of, we're Greek, we're Greek. And I was like, as soon as I could, I just, jettisoned out of that world. And I always had a kind of, my father's a writer. And so, there was always kind of it's okay to be an artist, It's like, okie dokie. I like to hear that. That sounds like way more fun than, working at a bank. So I had that kind of propulsion, but then to get away from the homeland, from Chicago and the family and the community, and also, just a bunch of Chicago guys, were still. I mean, they had done, everybody had done drugs, but how it manifests in the city in that city at that time. I went back later to work at Steppenwolf Theater, and it had changed a lot. It was much more accepting of creatives. You weren't so marginalized or just under the radar. So it sort of realized the value of the art scene, which every city does, right? I mean, that's where the real estate prices go up. Where you can, like Abbot Kinney and wherever you can have creatives around, have art openings and wine tastings and all that. But so when I arrived here, it was pretty just kind of, there were a bunch of people kind of doing this spiritual trip, which became Landmark and Esalen and those kinds of things. Everybody, there was gurus everywhere, Indian guys and pseudo Indian guys, and at the same time there was the punk scene, which was not really my scene, but I knew that was happening at the Mabua High and all around there, and that was really cool. But there was research and Vale and all those people were starting to publish, and of course those were seminal, right? I remember when I first came to San Francisco, I was in front of City Lights bookstore, and this guy, he looks like he just landed in San Francisco the day before, but he's all hippied out, and he goes, "Who are your originals, man? Who are your originals?" And I go, "Man, totally. I know what you're saying. These are the people that form you, whoever they might be. William Burroughs or Kenneth Payton or Marshall McLuhan or whoever kind of got through your stupid filters of ignorance and went, boing, listen to this, boing, listen to that." And so I think that we all were kind of running around with a little file cabinet in our heads of ideas that were unformed that somehow we wanted to form. So I know for me, being in theater and playing regular parts was always the kind of joke, right? Because it's like, don't step out of the play, don't step out of the play. You got to sort of keep to that reality. And I always I just, my first act of theater was to break the fourth wall as much as I could. So Spoonman would come out and he would just interact with the audience for as long as he wanted to. And people were encouraged to drink beer and shout, and do that kind of thing. So I knew that part of me was there, ready to pop out. And so that environment at the time gave me that. I think one thing I want to kick back on, because it's just something that came to me yesterday when I was talking to somebody, was the golden opportunity that was created in that 60s period, right? And it was such an explosion. And anybody who went through it probably, knows that there was this convergence of, pop culture got psychedelicized, urban culture got psychedelicized, and even everybody out in the heartland got psychedelicized. So there was this empowerment, generational empowerment that happened. And, you had like all these, creative, middle-class kids who, changed how art and culture would be processed. And then, of course, the commerce, people jump into it quickly. You have urban culture, a kind of sense of solidarity with Black Panthers, with indigenous peoples, realization that, shit, man, we're all the same consciousness. We're all the same awareness. What's keeping us apart? Bullshit's keeping us apart. And then by 67 or 68, even if you went to school in, the middle of Iowa, everybody had done psychedelics too. So there was this kind of awakening of a generation of kids who grew up outside of the city. So I think that was the great treasure from that period that we brought forward. And then everybody expressed it differently. And of course, we spent it. And so, gradually the treasure got, at least in a kind of initiating sense, it got smaller. But then, you go off and you start developing these things, right? And
yeah, I'm curious to hear more just to give us a slice of like some of the the craziest party events or theatrical explorations that you did once you arrived in the city, or through once you were kind of absorbing all of these influences. Of course, V-Veil and research is just iconic. I mean, it really gave a kind of context for the sort of punk energy by linking it to other trends in, esoteric practices, in literature, in other periods of cultural history. Like, it really created a very rich context. And I think it helped make, again, San Francisco be a unique place to draw off of these things, and at the same time keep reinvesting in the possibilities of the magic moment, of the spontaneous moment, of the moment where you don't know what's going on, of the moment where you're pulling it out of your ass and you're doing it together, and then something happens. There's this kind of extra event that leans in, or a sort of synchronicity, or a sort of collective magic that just sort of arrives. And it can be very subtle, it can be very silly, but it seems like unless you're throwing yourself, kind of down before the gods of chaos at least a little bit, that stuff isn't going to come. And for a while there was just a lot of room for that sort of invocation. So if any of this is like triggering memories of performances you were in, or events that happened that really knocked your socks off, I'd love to hear about it.
Okay, well, I mean, I certainly think like what you're describing is that process, from following up on what I was saying. When people come here, they come here for various reasons. There's a tolerance and an openness and an acceptance and non-judgment, really. I think that this is, when you think about today and you think about the various constraints that are around us, visible or invisible, it makes a lot of the stuff harder to do that kind of thing. Now, of course, if you're, 24 and you're here and you don't want to, get a great job programming, then you're still going to do chaotic stuff. And that's, more power to everybody who does that. And they can do it, at the same time, a lot of technology art is kind of advanced to a point where, the blur between the art and the commercial applications is thinner. I mean, I think if we go back there and to the late 80s and the early 90s, there was just like I don't know, people was, Mark was starting to work with robots, and there were other robot guys, Chico McMurtry and Matt Heckert, and it's just like it was jubilant to go to one of those shows. I mean, and watch fire spit across, the alleyways, and that was very exciting. And I think like all the Burning Man guys, John you mentioned, and Larry and Michael, they all used to come to the Annon Salon early on, and before there was a Burning Man, and they just had this kind of vision of what they wanted to do, and everybody was like, totally cool, that's great, and they put the man up at Baker Beach, and totally great, and and then the whole thing kind of developed out on the playa in a different way. But that was very similar to, creating a context. Like I kind of use that term avant vaudeville, because basically you are the vaudeville. You are running around and you are dropping your proscenium wherever you want it, and then you go, come forward, whatever. Hey, what the hell is that you're doing? It's like, well, I want to understand that. What are you doing, man? And because you're basically opening the door into somebody else's vision of their own anarchy, their own chaos that they want to express, and maybe you can help them, or you say, you should talk to this person. You do, do you control? Do you do controller stuff? Because you could totally put that through you mold over, or, those guys. That's what you're doing, So you're kind of bringing your theater with you as you go. And certainly, Burning Man is like one of the, I mean, I think what we blown away by Burning Man is like, that is the biggest fucking proscenium I have ever seen. I mean, that is like, why don't you put Africa inside that proscenium? It's so big. So the scale of that is very, trippy. And they used, there was great fire art out there at Burning Man before fire art became a concept in itself, right? It's sort of like, again, that idea of impressionists copying other impressionists. Somebody does fire art, and next year, 2 people, and then 10 people, and pretty soon, you've got a whole community of fire artists, and that follows today. So those kinds of events, those kind of impromptu public events that you knew were illegal and were crazy, but they were so energizing, and the people who did them were so dedicated. You had to, you knew there was no commercial possibility there. I mean, even the Cobra Lounge, I think I had 2 television producers that we tried to make it into a packageable item, but as soon as you turned up the lights on it, it just felt weird, It was supposed to be dark. It was supposed to be subconscious. It was supposed to be, extraterrestrial. And maybe now you could do it with lights, but then, taste changed too, and it's all fragmented. So
Yeah, but it does seem like that there's something about that resistance to being translated into an obvious sell, even an like an underground hit or something like that. That seems to be part of the mix. I always think about that movie about the Coquettes, the documentary about the Coquettes, who are of course this very they probably translate better than a lot of stuff in the 60s that was happening in San Francisco, in the sense that you can recognize within their crazy performances, and they would do these sort of anarchic, gay, colorful, ridiculous, celebratory, sacred, profane kind of events in San Francisco, very popular, and we can recognize the fashion sense. I mean, really, in a lot of ways, like the crazy fashions that we associate with later on with like Burning Man or other sort of freak scenes, you can trace back to some of the stuff that the Coquettes were doing. But in the film, it's really interesting. So they're huge in San Francisco. They're a buzz. Everybody loves them. They do these events that are kind of like rituals, but they're kind of like celebrations, and the community is recharged by their performances. And so they're like these hot shit performance artists, and they go to New York, and everybody is like super psyched. They're like, oh my God, the Coquettes are here. And they, I think they're Radio City, and like everybody goes, Warhol's there, everybody's there. And it was like a total dud. Like it didn't translate. There was something left in San Francisco that they couldn't bring, either a context, a sense of community, a different notion of art that's not so highbrow or something like that. Like there was something really missing, and that always struck me that there was some way in which this stream that we're talking about, at least for a very long time, just it resisted incorporation, whether it was into the market or even into existing forms of art and performance.
Right. I mean, you know how, language, of course, is kind of where everything begins, So how you frame things and how you discuss things. I think and I would like, in my other model there where I was kind of talking about pop culture, urban culture, heartland culture, queer culture is absolutely right up front, as is feminist culture. But there is a kind of disregard for precision. Like, fuck that, right? I mean, John would be a great person to talk to about this, and we've talked about this before. It's like, don't make it pretty, man. Don't make it pretty. Don't make it too precise. Don't make it too tight. Don't make it, because otherwise you just kill the mother, You turn it into a product, and now you're stuck, right? Now I knew the guy who wrote Grease. He was like, he used to hang out in Chicago on Lincoln Avenue, and he was a really nice guy. And somehow he wrote that play Grease as a really great little piece, right? Awesome, music collaborator, and my friend directed it for the first production. It was a small production. It was so cool, right? That became like the package that killed him, right? I mean, he never had to work again, and he died young. And so I think that in a lot of ways, if you're kind of in it for the long haul, that there's some roads that you just shouldn't take. There's some turnoffs you shouldn't take. Other people take them and they work great, right? I mean, I had a lot of friends who went to Hollywood, went to LA. I worked with Danny Glover when he was driving a cab, and then, he's off and he's a great, great, great man, and, Peter Coyote and Whoopi Goldberg and those kind of people. And, it's good. It's good. But, when I was in LA, I was like, I don't like LA. I don't like the business. And, agents, if I don't think of them as agents, are great. But when I think of them as agents, they're agents. And, so there's that kind of thing that the Cockettes totally had. And the Angels of Light totally had, which was like the gesture is what mattered. Do you see the scale of this gesture? Do you see how full we fill this experience here? And then, you sit outside, like a critic and pick it apart. Well, it's easy to pick apart. It left its bones exposed. It didn't try to hide them. It didn't pretend it was something other than it was. That whole thing was really magic. It was powerful. And it totally, swept through town. And of course, this is, kind of concurrent with the AIDS crisis too. So it had an even greater poignance for everyone's evolution, right? To realize that, wow, that person's gone. Those people are gone. That group is no more. So, there's an evanescence to art, right? Again, this is how you frame it, with your words, that you need to hold on to, and you need to hold on to that part of it, which is strong. Like Spoonman, for me, was like, that was a big wooden spoon, and he was ready to beat anybody up over the head with it. And, it was like it was sort of a silly way of kind of, protector of the nursery of the childlike spirit. But he was very Ubu-like too. He was very pompous, right? Jung said, when the subconscious speaks, it speaks in pompous tones. So, sometimes you got to be pompous, and other people look at that and go, oh, it's pompous, and they write it off, They go, no, they're not seeing where it comes from, where the roots are of that. So in terms of the, this sort of cavalcade of amazing, crazy events and groups and people, I think they were all part of that. They were all woven from those earlier threads of appreciation and tolerance and acceptance and enjoyment. I mean, just pure, oh my God, that's so much fun. I love that.
Yeah. One of the things you mentioned was how, nowadays it feels like everything is we're kind of boxed in this way. Even if we try to break out, there's already sort of a system there waiting to kind of capture and organize us. And the technology has a lot to do with this. And, in a lot of ways we're talking about is that what are the conditions that allow real creativity and sort of spontaneity and like unpredictability to happen in a way that might lead to things later on. And, ultimately things emerge that could be useful for the market or whatever. But nowadays it just feels like it's like always already organized. Like you can't get to that first place, and it's already mediated. It's already part of a scene. It already has discourse around it. It's really hard to kind of get out of the loop. But that's not how technology, at least in the sort of sense of digital technology, networks, the World Wide Web, all that stuff. That's not how it initially appeared. And I know that, because we're also talking about San Francisco in that sense, and you were part of, early internet culture in the early 90s, and, trying to figure out how to make it work for groups like The Residents and, Clubfoot Orchestra and other, kind of outsider groups. How did the emergence of early technology kind of change the dynamics?
Oh, yeah. Well, I mean, technology, sort of showed up around 88 or 89. For me, I was doing theater, and I ran into these two guys. Ted, he's a science fiction writer. Ted, and I can't remember his last name, and Andy Harris, and they both worked at Apple. And okay, so they had this idea. They had this script they were working on. It was a sitcom about Silicon Valley in 1988. It was like, I was like, wow, you guys are crazy. But I knew all the actors and the performers, and so I could easily cast it. But basically, we sat down and in diners and talked about stuff, and and they said, well, you need a computer and a modem and a printer, and I said, oh, okay, cool. And they stole one from Apple and they gave it to me, and I never had to give it back. And I got online because I knew Howard Rheingold, and our kids went to the same preschool, and and I just knew right away when I saw Howard. I went, okay, we got to be friends, and I got on the Well, which is early conferencing, asynchronous conferencing system, and all of a sudden, you were doing these late night, long threaded conversations with people in Germany and England and all over the place. And it was very psychedelic. It was like stage two of something, because like Howard uses that great term, mind. I think maybe it's Engelbart's term, but mind amplifier, right? All of a sudden, it's just like somebody gave you a PA and you could blast your thoughts out across the world. Well, the type of people that would come into your conversation, that was astonishing. Really, it was very. It felt very much like a psychedelic kind of opening that happened there, and so there. I remember going to a conference, and I go to these conferences where they basically invite me to go, and I don't know how they covered it, but like I remember Jim Clark having a little meetup with 40 people where we talked about, creating a browser. And I thought, well, why the fuck we got Mosaic? Who needs another browser, And, so there's my, my insight into, money making options. But that sort of sense of everything was just unformed, right? It all kind of came back to these connections, and connection obviously is a huge part of the art experience, or the community experience, right? That's ultimately what you're trying to do. It's almost like I sing, I dance, I hope I can connect, That's kind of what you do. No matter, I write, you write, Erik, you write. And so thereby you connect, I do, therefore I might be able to connect, So I think that that first experience of technology, just in text, in text-based technology, was a mind-boggler. And then you could, all of a sudden you could add images to it, and postage stamp videos, and that was pretty exciting. So, I mean, if you go back to that kind of, manger, Bethlehem kind of moment, um, all was possible. It was a great opening. And of course, you look at what that's become, because that, obviously that took off on a trajectory that took the whole culture with it, and all of capitalism with them. And, so, I don't know. I mean, partly, maybe, I think we're in a kind of a late stage of frivolity. It's harder to be funny. It's harder to, to like let it go. It's harder to, crap on things you don't like. It's like somebody's going to make a complaint, or, other people are going to like, raise their eyebrows, and, so there's a kind of, taming of the wild that happens. And I remember those early days, it was kind of like, it was like the land rush, it was like everybody was kind of racing out into cyberspace, um, not knowing what they would find, and they would find amazing things. So I think now we kind of, we kind of know what's out there, man. There's the dark web, and weirdness, and people's weirdness is
Well,
reflected.
one of the things that I think about, that I even brought up in the little spiel I did when you had a Pataphysical Society gathering, a few months ago, is, you've talked about Ubu, we've talked about Dada, we talked about that kind of, if you remember their original response to the horror of World War I, to the collapse of all the claims of technological progress, and that somehow Western civilization was so advanced, and then you have this absolute absurd nightmare of World War I, and like the only reasonable response is to just be kooky and to like break the codes and to undermine the pretensions and to create a space where something else might happen. I mean, just to have like a real unknown in the room. And now it's so weird. On the one hand, the wilderness has been tamed, that we're organized and interpolated by technology and all these networks and algorithms and tracking systems. And at the same time, there's also the sense that like reality, in the sense of reasonable ideas about what's going on, or science, or agreements about how to run something, in the pragmatic everyday sense, like that whole world is actually getting weirder and weirder. So some of that absurdity and almost psychedelic sense of a hall of mirrors is now like our daily reality, even as we're kind of more woven into these systems of control. And so I don't know, and I'm curious how you feel about this whole heritage, this whole lineage. It's almost like an anti-lineage, an anti-tradition of pulling the rug out from under, of going for spontaneity, of going for frivolity, of like radical frivolity. Does it have a place? Is it almost more of an eclipsed strategy that no longer really works with our current crisis? How do you have a sense of the place where this stuff, exists in relationship to our present moment?
Right. Well, I think it all distills down to you. I mean, there's insert Terence McKenna riff there, but it really does. Your use of the term kookiness, strikes the eternal part of me as the wrong word. I think what people are striving for in breaking boundaries is invincibility. In other words, you can't fuck with me. You can't fuck with me. I know mind control is everywhere. I know we are all being fucking, chipped, stamped, and marked for extinction. I know that. I see it. Everything I watch, almost 90% of it, is total bullshit, right? It's just complete control mechanisms. And then you watch people just responding to it. And, and like the Ubu Trump guy is like the most amazing improvisational creature ever to struck the world stage. It's like if you read Ubu, you go, God damn, this is boring. He's not saying anything. Trump, he can say shit. And not only that, but he gets like billions of millions of people to run around like, like scared cats when he does that. So, going back then to what we're trying to preserve is similar to, what you try to teach your children. That don't be afraid of the boogeyman, don't be afraid of the CIA. Brennan's a schmuck, they're all schmucks. They've all sold their souls, there really are fucked up people out there. And they've got more control than they ever had before. And so that's our current situation that we're in, right? This is where you and I both live, and everybody else who's listening. You all live in this reality that's been completely, put together with just the basic intention of controlling you and your impulses.
So what's that invincibility about?
Well, the invincibility is about the self. It's about your own sort of belief in what love is and what creativity is and what communion is and what connection is and what, all these things are. When you feel attraction, what are you feeling? You're like, oh, she's so cute. I feel really attracted to her, Or is she like, whoa, there's something magic going on. Excuse me while I explore. Well, let me just, perceive it, receive it, appreciate it, enjoy it, celebrate it. That is like, you are stepping outside of reality, right? When you do that, you are stepping into your own imagination, and I think that's where the invincibility comes. We get old, we fall apart. I can't kick your ass anymore. But that doesn't mean that I'm not invincible. That doesn't mean that the spirit that's in me is not the spirit of my grandfathers and my ancestors and of the earth and of the trees that they grew up under. Even if I, live in a condo south of Market, which I don't, but, it's like there is that which is not, which is off limits. And that's the individual spirit. And I think that goes back to, the artist inside of the culture, inside of the context of, the Bay Area and all these different cultures that sprang up and you suddenly found yourself flowering on this tree over here and other people were flowering on that tree. So there's a kind of biological root to this kind of activity. So that's kind of what I mean by invincible. In other words, it's like that George Carlin rap about the earth, nature's going to slough you off so quick, the earth is the world. Is all this shit is way bigger than our bullshit. So identifying with it in that way is kind of how art. I think how art sort of takes on some religious overtones.
Yeah, and particularly that aspect of art, or particularly performance, whether musical or improvisation or crazy parties or stage vaudeville or whatever, is that's a place where the kind of throwing the dice into the moment or making the move, or as you said before, pulling it out of your ass, can paradoxically create the sense of invincibility or of the pure reality of the moment. And in that sense, it becomes very related to spirituality. Even though we're not using spiritual language, we're not talking about gurus, we're not talking about ideas of the afterlife or anything like that. There's something about cultivating and continuing to evoke and invoke the possibility of that kind of encounter, of that kind of falling in love with, of that kind of hilarity, like a synchronicity almost. It's like the way that when synchronicity strikes, it doesn't matter if your reason is going, yeah, that was just a coincidence. Don't make a big deal out of it. And and you're not even just enjoying the moment. It's like suddenly there's like this transformative implication, and you can play with that. You can weave that. It can be a way to resist other sorts of stories or demands that are coming in from the external world. So it's a lifesaver that kind of links art and spirit in a way because I always felt that about San Francisco. From the outside, things can look really frivolous or goofy. Or looking at Burning Man, for example, oh, it's just a crazy party, and it's just the sort of whatever, the inmates taking over the asylum and stuff like that. But I always saw the sacred dimension of it, and not in earnest, so over serious way, but more like a real appreciation for the transformative potentials of chaos, or of the unknown, that are willingly brought into the environment by a kind of throwing yourself forward outside of your habits, and doing that in relationship with others, in the sense of expression or performance, and that kind of, those kind of feedback loops are remarkably powerful, and they still exist. It's just, I think that it requires almost more work, or something. It requires something different to create those conditions now.
Well, it does require a dedication over time. I mean, what you were talking about there, in terms of when I first came here, the first thing I did was join up with a couple other guys, and we started a vegan cafe in the mid '70s on Union Street. So you can imagine that was about 20 years ahead of its time. But all these spiritual type people, all these transformed, people would come in, and we'd talk. And because I was meditating and doing my thing, all I wanted to know was what their experience was. What's your experience? And a lot of people, they don't trust their experience, and so they put a grid over it of ideas, right? So belief systems, there's 6 levels of reality, and it's like, hey, dude, if I want to read a book, I can read a book. I'm asking you, what's your experience? So that is, I think, the sacred. That is the sacred, and the trust in experience, and improvisation. Like, improvisation is a kind of primal artistic activity, right? It's like, you call me, I don't know what you're going to ask me, and I'm just going to improvise my way through it. And that happens to you, I'm sure, in your life, where all of a sudden you don't know, I don't know what's happening now. So I'm just going to say something, or I'm going to do something, and I'm going to trust that, there'll be stepping stones from that. And I think people understand that. That's why they do all these workshops and shit, to find out how they can not worry about there not being anything there when they walk. But there will be something there if you walk, if you go towards that. So trusting in that experience inside of you, I think, is part of the power that, supports you, the fuse that, that lights up your juice and makes you happen. And I think that's key.
Oh yeah, and I mean, just to kind of tie it back a little bit, is the thought that's coming to mind right now, is that one of the purposes of art, and particularly satirical art, absurdist art, surreal, that whole kind of current of sort of glorious madness, is that it helps to break down the grid of ideas that people build around their experience. So even if, like you say, like, you're a spiritual practitioner and you're honing your like immediate experience in meditation, on the yoga mat, there's this flip-flop where then, in order to kind of organize these new novelties, you have a bunch of language or ideas that come from outside. And you see this tension all the time, particularly in spirituality. And in a way, like art, and absurd art in particular, caustic art, and I would also say things like horror and just intense, like, whatever, spectral, supernatural ideas, mysteries, gothic, the weird, all of that stuff helps to deform those grids and possibly get you back into your own experience, because you're always going to use words, and the words are borrowed, the words are taken from the culture that pre-exists you. But there's a difference between adopting a grid and kind of trusting your own on the seat of the pants ability to create a story or a meaning or a context or an exuberant expression out of something that's closer to personal experience. And I would really like to believe that font is still there, even as we live in a very different time, that there's still something about experience that holds those possibilities.
Yeah, well, I mean, it may be that San Francisco, as what it was, is not anymore. And so if we're trying to make generalizations around the place, it may be that's very difficult to maintain. It's very difficult to maintain in any American city, big urban center right now. But maybe time to go to Portugal, or who knows. But the point, I think, is that that need that we all have in the most simplest everyday sense of being interested in what's happening around us, and also being attracted to experience or art or media that plays on our need for the unexpected. In other words, I don't want to hear a story I've heard before. And if after 2 minutes of talking to you, that's what it feels like, I'm looking for the exit. I'm looking for the exit. So the idea is, how do you sustain that in your own life? How do you keep that story alive in your own life and attracted to other stories of other people who live, a marvelous moment, and put those marvelous moments together? And we are invincible through time. We will not be squashed. The city may get, fucked up, or, we may get, who the fuck knows what's going to happen. But that spirit is not going to be squashed. I mean,
wonderful. Well, I think we're going to have to end it there. That's a beautiful place to end. And thanks so much for talking with us about this stuff on Expanding Barn Mark.
Sure. Thank you.
All right, folks. That's Mark Petrakis, a.k.a. Spoonman. And until next week, keep your minds open.